I just want to see if I do this.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is 6 o'clock. We have to start to allow us enough time for the evening's discussions. I would like to heartily welcome each and every one of you. It's wonderful seeing all the familiar faces and also some new faces. So welcome, and I trust that you'll all enjoy our evening, our discussion tonight. And also, I would like to ask Bronwyn Moody from Windhoek to say something on behalf of the bank, because it is a new start, and they would just like to add something to our welcome.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for the introduction. My name is Bronwyn Moody. I am Head of Stakeholder Engagement, Sponsorships and CSR for Bank Windhoek. So tonight I am on duty, and I welcome you all here tonight. We are so excited to see so many new faces, as Willem had said, many familiar faces, so many new faces. But yet, allow me to please acknowledge tonight our chairperson, Johan Swanepoel, chairperson for the Bank Windhoek board. I think Dr. Willem Moore, our organizer for this Bank Windhoek Socratic Forum. Prof. Esterhuyse, who is our speaker for tonight from the Department of Strategic Studies at the University of Stellenbosch. My colleagues, I see a few faces, and all of you here tonight. The Bank Windhoek Socratic Forum has been in existence for quite a number of years, if I'm correct, from 2013. So that is quite a period that we've been involved. And believe you me, we are very excited to have you all here tonight and for us to kick off the 2023 Bank Windhoek Socratic Forum. We all know we had the dreaded COVID-19 pandemic, and unfortunately, everything came to a halt. So we had to take a small hiatus with the Socratic Forum as well. But we're all here tonight and we're excited to have you and be able to kickstart and this with you again. I think what is important for us is, seeing that it's so popular and also just listening to a conversation, the fact that we've received so many requests for the forum to commence again. It is important that we say that we resume and continue with our primary focus, which aims to stimulate critical thinking while connecting diverse opinions. With that said, ladies and gentlemen, for tonight we are excited to announce that a partnership with another truly Namibian brand, Gondwana Collections Namibia, who has come on board to join us as a sponsor for the Socratic Forum. So may I ask that we give them a round of applause, please. We are honored to partner with this like-minded organization while we continue to live out our pledge to be connectors of positive change. Willem, as we say, Dr. Moore, we thank you for your efforts and the work that you have done in establishing the Bank Windhoek Socratic Forum. And also we look forward to growing this relationship as we commence in 2023. So please sit back and enjoy, and I'm sure this will be a very, very insightful conversation we're about to have.
Thank you very much, Bronwyn. we don't want to keep you, but seeing that we've got so many new faces tonight, let me just introduce the Socratic Forum to you. The Socratic Forum, as you would have seen on the ads, is under the banner, let's say, not only of Weinberg, but also the father of modern philosophy, modern thinking, Socrates. And you've seen one of his famous quotes, "All I know is that I don't know." Now that doesn't mean that he doesn't know anything. He was a really, really intelligent person. But what he had in mind was to make us aware of the immensity of the knowledge in the world. And therefore he introduced what is still today called the Socratic dialogue. And we try to follow that dialogue in our meetings to bring, as Bronwyn said, to hone our skills in critical thinking. Now, I think there are a lot of misperceptions about critical thinking. Many people think critical thinking means to criticize what other people say. But it is just the opposite. Critical thinking, according to Socrates, means to criticize your own views in the light of the views of other people. Do not be so sure about what you are saying because of the immensity of reality, of all the possibilities. And therefore we try to follow the 4 steps of the Socratic dialogue. I will say a little bit later more on it, but the 4 steps, it was also in the press. The first step, if we start talking to each other, and remember where it all started. It started on the market square in Athens, not at a university or at some highfalutin place at the market square, where Socrates started talking to people and listening to people. And he made these 4 very important guidelines. When we start interacting with each other, first of all, let's bracket our own opinions. Commit ourselves to the argument. Follow the argument where it leads, and rather let our ideas die in our place. These 4 very important elements of the Socratic dialogue. And we try to implement and to honor it in the Socratic Forum. To stimulate our discussion and stimulate ourselves tonight, I would like to, from my side, also welcome Professor Esterhuyse. I think he's very well known on the radio and national and international television. You've seen his CD, and I would just like to say, it's a huge honor for us to have you here tonight, and we're looking forward to listening to you. Thank you.
Don't mind me sort of changing this a little bit. Ladies and gentlemen, there's nothing that's humbling and academic like being reminded about the body of knowledge that's out there, that has been built up throughout history. And that you, as an individual academic, tries to make inroads into that massive amount of existing knowledge that is already in existence. It's a humbling experience, and I carry the title of professor and doctor in absolute humbleness, because you know that you don't know. And so it's from that position I'm speaking to you tonight. And I'm speaking to you about conflict, violence, and war in a way that my wife always reminds me that in terms of size, I'm the last person to talk about conflict, because I talk from a Bakkies Botha perspective, and I have an unnatural advantage. The question that have driven my own thinking for tonight, in a way, was rooted in a question as to whether we're really living today in the most peaceful time in the existence of humanity, as was said by a thinker from Harvard University. And in exploring that question, of course, we need to talk about, and there's my speech disappearing, we need to talk about the manifestation of this phenomenon in humanity, and I'm talking about conflict, and also how we deal with this. And the interesting thing about this phenomenon, whether you like the idea of conflict, violence, war, it sort of enters your life every day through TV and television and news, and also, of course, in what is going on in society around us. And if we talk about conflict, violence, and war, it is important to understand that it's deeply, deeply rooted in who we are as humans, in the differences of our beliefs, our needs, our wants, the views of lives and of our life and obligations we have, the clash of interests. Whether we're talking about conflict at an individual level, or whether we're talking, hello Andres, or whether we're talking about conflict at a collective level, this is where it is to be found. And of course, from a definitional perspective, conflict contains a number of clear characteristics. I particularly like the idea, and I've often worked with the idea of Andre Bouw, that conflict, in essence, is about the dialectic of two opposing wills using force to resolve a dispute. And perhaps we need to consider that definition, and I'm taking this definition sort of out of what I've listed, the dialectic, the interplay. In other words, there's at least two parties involved in conflict at all times. The fact that it's living human beings with a will, that we're talking about the idea of force, and we're not defining the idea of force, we're just saying that conflict always contains some form of force. And of course, a dispute is found throughout the world, from the individual level to the highest levels of power in the world. And so conflict is sort of accepted as an inherent human activity that's tied to the human will. But there's always some form of violence and force involved. And the important thing is that this creates an adversarial context that we cannot walk away from, that we cannot ignore. The question for me always is, and this is where for me the dichotomy is in understanding conflict. How conflict often leads us down the pathway towards peace and security. That it's sort of an input, a starting point for the creation of peace and security. And then the irony that out of peace and security, you always have the unfolding of conflict, violence, and should I use the word, war. And this is what I think Charles Tilly had in mind when he made his well-known remark that the war made the state, but the state also made war. It's this dichotomy, this interplay, that is so difficult to understand, and it sort of raises a question for me. Where is conflict located before peace and after peace? If we think about conflict as humans, we also tend to think of the extremes of conflict. And we always sort of tend to put peace and war up there as the opposite, as the extreme opposite, without thinking that somewhere in the middle, that's why there's what I refer to as the black box. And that black box contains conflict and violence in a way that we have not sort of come to terms with in the world we're living in. And the example that I always use in this regard is that the period between 48 and 94 in South Africa is probably seen as the most conflict-ridden period in the history of South Africa. You know, they look at the number of deaths in that period, and they sort of linked it to between 14 and 20,000 people, sometimes up to 21,000 people. And it was considered a time of intense conflict and violence. And yet, what we have seen since 1994 in South African society, normally considered as a democratic society and supposed to be at peace with itself, well, quite an extensive number of people have died since then. So, if I hang those two questions up there, for me, and here I'm asking questions because I don't have the answers. There's at an individual level, thinking about conflict and violence at an individual level in society, a question as to what constitutes peace. What constitutes peace? What sort of conflict and violence ought to be removed from society to create what we consider to be a positive peace, not a negative peace, a positive peace? What kind of security we need to establish for people at an individual level to experience peace, and the kind of peace where we let our kids play in the streets, where we walk home at night in security. And I don't even want to talk about what kind of peace is required in cases where people are experiencing social, economic, political discrimination, social injustice, structural discrimination. It's not as if it's disappearing in our society. And then the very important question, what kind of violence, what kind of conflict is needed for us to deal with conflict and violence, to bring about the peace and security that is required, that dichotomy that I referred to. If we raise the question to the level of the collective, whether we're talking about societies, little towns, neighborhoods, or the state, the continent of Africa, it brings questions as to can there be politics, can there be peace, can there be security without conflict and violence? Is it possible for us to have this without conflict and violence? And of course, there's the deep-rooted question of humanity and violence. The fact that we are so predisposed to conflict and violence. And of course, there's a structural reality of the world we're living in, the world where the state is still the predominant and most important organized entity in the world we're living in, and whether peace and security is actually possible between states without violence and conflict. So this is sort of the questions that was in my mind. And then you read Professor Colin Gray's book, and I'm an apostle of Colin Gray. It's the body of knowledge that I like, and a fountain that I like to drink at. Colin Gray, in his book, War, Peace and International Relations, and if you haven't read the book, read it. But he talks about the grand strategic narrative in the world, and what he outlines in that book is the dichotomy, the interplay between conflict, violence and war in the world that we've seen, and we've just sort of covered the history from the Napoleonic Wars up until where we are today. And the most fascinating thing about the grand strategic narrative that he outlines is that every time at the end of major conflict, violence and war in the world, we're going through a period of peace where we really try to develop mechanisms to maintain peace and security. In the last 100 years, the League of Nations, in the aftermath of the Great War, later on become known as the First World War, the creation of the United Nations in the aftermath of the Second World War, by the way, 20 million people losing their lives in the First World War. That number, 77 million in the Second World War. Creating the League of Nations, or the United Nations in its aftermath, to try and create some forum for us to maintain peace and security. And it wasn't 5 years after the Second World War that the Americans deployed their forces into Korea with the Russians marching over the Yellow River again. And we were at war again. And since then, we've had an interesting time in the history of the world called the Cold War. And the Cold War seen millions of people die, predominantly in the developing world, in the so-called Third World. And then the interesting period after the Cold War, I refer to it as the Mandela period. And it was indeed a period of peace and security, at least in my country. And the ideas that were floating around in the 1990s of human security, the widening and a deepening of the security and the demilitarization of security, and how we need to push the security forces to the periphery of society. They are an outdated entity. 1991 Gulf War, Rwanda, Balkans, 9/11, global war on terror, Ukraine. We're not there as yet. Vietnam. So here's the important reality. I've paraphrased Leon Trotsky's well-known quote here, that perhaps you may not be interested in conflict and violence and war, ladies and gentlemen, but it is interested in you, and you are to be affected by it, whether you like the idea or not. And I've listed a couple of things that sort of people don't think about when we talk about conflict, violence and war. Yes, there's a huge amount of suffering, and that in itself ought to draw our attention, and this is perhaps why a lot of us are sitting here tonight. Many unanswered questions and unanswerable questions. But I said to my sister this afternoon, How many of you are using a cell phone, a GPS, the internet? That's creations of the US Army in an effort to deal with conflict, violence, and war in the world. And we know that conflict, violence, and war, should we say, led to peace in Namibia. It is always a catalyst for peace. I said to you, it's an input. And of course, peacemaking had become a business in Africa. There's a lot of people who's making huge amounts of money from peace in Africa, peacemaking in Africa. In fact, there's an argument that there's a deliberate effort to maintain conflict, violence, and war in the world because people are making money out of it. It's not only in Africa. Of course, within the security institutions, there's glory, there's promotion, there's medals. And for politicians, I don't know how they think about successful conflict. Sometimes difficult to understand that. But there's no doubt, and I see that in my own society every day, the amount of vandalistic destructiveness that is brought about by conflict and violence. So if we then look at conflict and violence from an analytical perspective, it is interesting to note that it has two sources. Internal vulnerability is as much a source of conflict as external threats, whether at the individual level or between states. And I always explain this to my students through the question of, do you give offense or do you take offense? Because it will reflect as to whether the threat is coming from outside or whether it's your own vulnerability that makes you feel insecure. My wife complains about walking through Cape Town, she's feeling vulnerable. I walk through Cape Town and I don't feel vulnerable. And this is the reality of conflict, violence, and war. Is Putin's war in Ukraine the result of a feeling of vulnerability or a feeling of threat? The good news, and this is where I sort of want to move to how we deal with conflict up until now. The good news is that organized conflict, at least, is in decline. I cannot talk about, the conflict that is going on at an individual level within households. But in terms of global deaths because of conflict, we are making progress. We are indeed living in a peaceful world, much more peaceful than it used to be. And that gives us an indication as to what has happened to defense spending in the last 40, 50 years. What is that, 1970? And there's an interesting question in those two slides, because conflict is in decline and defense budgets are in decline. And it raises an immediate question. And here's the interesting reality that I want to show to you that is actually giving us what I've just said. Sorry for the maps of the world that's circumscribed, but the top map is a map of the world that's drawn to reflect the size of the defense budget. I want you to look at Africa. I want you to see who's spending on defense sake that red line on top is Russia. And then I want you to superimpose the lower map that's reflecting violent deaths and conflict, deaths because of violence and conflict. I want you to superimpose those two maps on each other, because it's giving us another picture. And let me say this. I always wonder why Africa is the most demilitarized piece of real estate in the world. Look in terms of defense spending, very little money in Africa is spent on defense. And I'm leaving the idea with you. I'm not making a moral judgment on it. I just want you to reflect on that. And look what is going on in terms of conflict, violence and war in Africa, in terms of violent deaths in Africa. It brings us to the idea of there will always be, I think it was Bismarck who said, there will always be a military on your territory. It's either your own or that of somebody else. In Africa, it's always a rebel movement of some sort. So let's try and typologize conflict, violence and war from the individual level to the interpersonal, to the collective level. And for me, the important point here is for you to see how conflict, violence, war unfold at a physical, social, psychological and level of deprivation. And then how we see the progression from violence to conflict to war in our world we live in. And it brings us to this question of the interplay between conflict, violence and war. And there's a very interesting reality in there. The interplay between frequency and intensity. Because we often have violence in our society, and the frequency of violence is sometimes very high, but it doesn't necessarily lead to death. On the other hand, the frequency of organized violence, especially in terms of war, is relatively low. But the number of people dying in the Ukraine and other places at the moment is absolutely mind-boggling. Absolutely mind-boggling. I cannot think about seeing the graves of 2,000 Russian sons and daughters. 200,000. An interesting thing here, if you look at that interplay between violence at a more individual level and organized violence at a level of conflict and war, there seems to be a trend in the world that we want to delegitimize violence on an individual level. We're using legislation, societal pressure, and all other kinds of activities to keep it from happening. We don't want to have it. It's not good. And we've created an entity called the police to actually keep it from happening. And there's a whole structure, judiciary and everything is set up to deal with violence on this level. And we organize pressure groups and others in society to root it out. But at a collective level, instead of trying to root it out, we've walked the pathway of trying to regulate it. We've accepted it as a given, and we've put international legislation in place to try and deal with it. Use ad bellum, law before war, in other words, the just war principle. It's what Colin Powell tried to do at the Security Council before the 2023 illegal American invasion of Iraq, trying to throw a little saucy at it over the legitimacy of that operation. Use ad bellum. The Americans illegally entered another state. Russia has created a narrative, all kinds of narratives, to justify his illegal war in Ukraine. Use ad bellum principle. You just need to explain to us as to why you need to do it. You just need to provide justification to us for why you are using conflict violence. If you can give us a good reason, you're good to go. And then, if you do it, there's another set of rules to make sure you do it in a just way. Use in bellum, Geneva Convention, and all these kinds of activities or legislation. So let me shift the debate and the argument to how we are thinking about conflict, violence, and war in the world today. And if I explore the literature and the body of literature on conflict, violence, and war in the world today, there seems to be three ways in which people tend to think about conflict, violence, and war in the world. The first is sort of a cataclysmic understanding. It happens. You can do nothing about it. It's like a flood or a drought. It's a victim outlook on conflict, violence, and war. And there's an interesting sort of geographical dimension linked to the cataclysmic thinking about conflict, violence, and war. They will say Africa, the Middle East. That's the places where it occurred. You can do nothing about conflict, violence, and war in Africa, the Middle East. It's just who those places are. That's just, it is. Or it's linked to an in-group, out-group idea. 100 years ago, it was the Germans. Now it seems to be the Arabs and the Africans. That's sort of the victims of conflict, violence, and war. So there's a cataclysmic, it's a cataclysmic event. We can do nothing about it. It happens. I don't want to use the bumper sticker from Forrest Gump, but Forrest Gump's bumper sticker explains it very, very nice. Let me first deal with a third understanding of conflict, violence, and war in the world, and this is a Clausewitzian understanding, German military philosopher, Karl von Clausewitz, who came up with this idea that war is a continuation of politics by other means. And what he's trying to say is that there's utility, there's value, there's a purpose. We can use it for something. We can try and use it to integrate Ukraine into Russia again. We can try and use it to get rid of Saddam Hussein. Political purpose. it serves a purpose, political purpose specifically. And they are framing this in interesting language these days, eh? Regime change and all other kinds of explanations to talk about the political understanding. And then there's the eschatological understanding that's sort of growing in sort of its leader, its fellowship. And that is the idea that all conflict and violence in the world and war in the world is part of a much bigger conflict between good and evil in the world. And some think that the perfect, the utopia, will come out of the ashes of the conflict and the violence in the world we have in the world today. And all religions have it in their scriptures, whether we're talking about Armageddon or jihad. People still kill in the name of religion. But there's also another sort of eschatological understanding, and it's very often framed in ideological terms. If we can just spread democracy around the world, if we can just spread socialism, communism around the world, it's already in place, we just need to spread it. And so we justify conflict and violence through the need to spread the message. Interesting here is that particular framing of conflict, violence and war in the world is actually rising in acceptance, whether it's coming from the American New Con perspective about Christianity or whether it's coming from Osama bin Laden, the other side of the coin, so to speak. Conflict, violence and war is interestingly woven into our lives today, from business, the war on drugs, the war on crime, the war on so many things we're fighting in our society. Listen to the phraseology thereof. And in the process, there's huge debate about how we're going to de-weaponize conflict. In other words, conflict is all right if we just don't have weapons, if we don't add the ability to kill. And it raises interesting questions about the modernity of conflict and the modernity of the era we're living in and conflict. Let's talk about conflict resolution. And I'm not going to, I'm not an expert on conflict resolution. But the one thing that I've learned from Colin Gray is that you need to have a comprehensive approach. This American idea of a single factor analysis to deal with conflict, violence and war is not going to work in the complexity of the world we're sitting in. Because every single strategic situation we face in the world has at least 7 critical contexts. And if we don't deal with conflict and peace and create conflict and peace, incorporating those 7 contexts, the historical context of peace in Namibia, political, social, cultural, economic, technological, operational dimension, how we operate on a daily basis, geographical dimension, will not be able to end conflict, violence in the world today. Problem with context, let me just say this. There's always a danger to be overwhelmed by context if you manage conflict, if you're trying to resolve conflict. Should I say that again? And context, I'm always explaining to my students, you need to understand context as a sort of an onion. Because the more you're peeling the more you expose the next layer of context. There's always more context to context. And this is often the problem with conflict resolution, that we are so overwhelmed by context that it becomes almost impossible to see the noise, the signals through all the noise that is going on. My good friend Jackie Silvio won't mind me using one of his slides, but I really like Jackie's idea of conflict resolution, simply because he highlights the critical elements thereof. Create security. You're not going to end conflict if you cannot create some form of security. You're not going to end conflict if you don't build capacity, state capacity, and other forms of capacity. And you're not going to create peace and stability if you're not inclusive in your approaches. And then the good news, the very good news, is that if you read the growing literature on non-violent resistance, it is interesting to observe that non-violent resistance in the world we're living in today is much, much better in creating peace and stability. It's quite interesting. Society-based non-violent resistance. I sort of gathered that I'm not supposed to talk about the instruments of conflict, violence and war tonight in an analysis of conflict. But I want to say one thing about the role of militaries in the world today. And I'm not talking about the Russian military. But what we have seen in the last 50 years, in fact from the end of the Second World War, was how militaries have evolved from instruments of war fighting, or as Professor Huntington put it, from instruments for the management of violence. In my jargon, that boils down to war fighting. But how the role of militaries have evolved, firstly, to include the management of defense, in other words, a peacetime role to maintain peace and security in the state. It's not only instruments of war, it's also instruments to maintain peacetime security through the management of defense, with the key idea of deterrence ingrained into the idea of the management of defense. To the post-Cold War environment, where we've now added another layer to the responsibility of armed forces, and that is the importance of managing peace and use them as instruments of peace. And there's once again an irony locked up in that, because soldiers are not dying in conflict, violence and war in the world anymore, and I'm excluding Russia's little adventure there. The people dying in conflict, violence and war today is women and children. And and it is people working for NGOs, for the United Nations, African Union. It's not soldiers. And that's the irony of the world we're living in, having instruments that's actually set up to deal with this, but they're not dealing with it. I'm going to leave you with the last quote that I really like, and I have it in my office for quite some time now. Life is like a book. Some chapters are sad, some happy, some exciting even. But if you never turn the next page, you will never know what's in the next chapter. Conflict has the power to make a reader turn the next page. If there's no conflict, any reader can most definitely guess what the next chapter holds. Happily ever after. Make the story predictable and not exciting at all. And I want to leave you with that idea. Because conflict is an interesting phenomenon in terms of who we are as human beings. Right, I draw the line there, Varun.
Thank you, Abel. We will probably thank you afterwards, but thank you so much for introducing us into this very, very interesting and very, very alarming world. Let me just return to my opening remarks regarding the nature of this. Well, it's not a society, it's a forum. What do we mean by a forum? It is not a debating society. We are not trying to win a debate or to win our point over another person's point. We are here to listen to each other and to learn from each other. And for that reason, we organize our question time as follows. I would like you to respond, but when you respond, please start your response by saying, I agree, and provide us with your reason, as short as possible, or I disagree, and provide us with your reason for disagreement. And then we are, with the help of the marketing section of Weinberg, this event is for the first time streamed live. And I asked the operator here tonight whether he would like to also take the shots of the people asking the questions, making contributions, and he's more than willing. He just asked me, would you be comfortable, ladies and gentlemen, if he turns around and photograph while you're putting your point? Would that be okay? All right. Thank you. Who would like to start our discussion for tonight? I've got a mic. I've got a roving mic here, I think. Let's see. Is it on? Andreas?
Someone has to start.
Yes. Let's keep it short, and then after a couple of contributions, I'll ask Professor Esterhuyse to respond.
It's fine. My name is Andreas Vogt. I'm from Windhoek. I'm a local. I've got one question. It pertains to the climate issue that we are being exposed to in politics and via the medias. My question is simply whether the climate debate is contributing towards international global conflict, yes or no, and if so, in what form? Thank you.
Thank you. May I ask that you just say I agree or I disagree, that you start your contribution?
Well, since this is a first starting question, I have nothing to agree or disagree on. Thank you.
Right. Who's next? Yes, yes, sir. There is a hand right in the back, Dorman. Right in the back, the gentleman in the back.
Yes, after saying thank you for this very interesting presentation, I would like to say I agree to that conflict seems to be an unavoidable factor of human coexistence. However, there are societies, if you go to Tabaru, Nauru, Naura, and other societies, like for example Eskimo societies and people in Hayaladak and so on, where the differences in the living circumstances are not as, let's say, eclatant, I don't know whether that's an English word, but as eye-catching or as significant as they are in others, where conflicts normally do not reach, according to my information, do not reach violent levels. I would not say that there would be no conflicts or no differences in interests, but according to my limited knowledge, it seems that their violence is actually absent or almost unknown, which of course sheds a light on what are the reasons for conflicts, and also would possibly open up a strategy of how to deal with conflicts if it is true that the lack of or the absence of large differences in people's living circumstances prevent them.
Thank you very much. The gentleman right at the back, please.
Sorry, I need to express myself to in fact illustrate that you need to add a type into your typology, and that's probably displacement. Yes, in addition to what was already said, of course some of these things are either implicitly or explicitly induced for whatever purpose we shall never know, because that's the complexity of humanity. And in its complexities, in the attributes of humanity or humans, you will never understand whether these are induced or natural occurrences, in essence, as explained by the person who was just asking about the climate change, all these issues that surrounds climate change. Maybe we need to go and take these examples, visit Bhutan, and probably try to experience from their lessons and see how we can turn that subsequent page to near ideal peace and security.
Thank you very much. Any more contributions? Yes, please, that lady, please.
Good evening, everyone. I'd just like to say thank you so very much for the very eye-opening talk tonight. I only partially agree, only because as a millennial, I think there's absolute blame to be cast on certain powers that be, right? right? So my question is, especially in the context of resource acquisition, right? And where it obviously looks like certain conflicts are occurring specifically to rob and take advantage of certain territories. What do you have to say about that? I think we tend to cast a blind eye, especially the older generations, in the interest of peace or in the interest of just, keeping things going peacefully. But there's definitely blame to be cast, and I think we should be highlighting these contexts, especially in the modern world.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Would you like to comment on these four points now?
The climate debate is a very difficult one, and there's a huge trap that I don't want to step into. And the trap is simply because there's so many conspiracy theories floating around about the climate, what is unfolding in the environmental environment. And I'm also not going to dwell on what is proven by science and what not. I'm not a scientist. But I can tell you this, and it ties into your question. There's no doubt that environmental factors are to become a major source of conflict in future. In fact, you just need to think about what is happening to your Rhino population in this country to understand what I'm trying to say. I don't even want to talk about what the need for water in future will look like in terms of a generator of conflict and violence. Grazing land, we already see that in places like Ethiopia and other places becoming a major issue. So I'm skipping the question on climate, but I want to say to you that environmental security is going to become one of the critical, most important security issues in our lifetime. It has already arrived. The power generation in South Africa is going to affect our water. And I can go on about the knock-on effects that will have. So let me just deal with this. Pacific societies, Pacific societies, of course there are Pacific societies in the world. And there's rich literature on the nature of that society. It's a well-researched entity. But I think there's two factors that's always sort of featuring in the discussion on these societies. And the first factor concerns resources, that there's a balance between the need of the people and what is the environment able to provide. And so there's a balance between a humanity living in close proximity with their environment. I think that's the first point that I want to make. There's a balance between the availability of resources and the distribution thereof in society. That's the first point. The second point is the very dangerous concept of relative deprivation. People in this small village that don't know that they are poor until somebody arrives and builds a palace on the hill with a huge car. And then all of a sudden, all hell breaks loose. And so the idea of relative deprivation is always a major issue. You you're driving through Zululand in Natal and people seems to be peaceful and at peace with themselves. And you introduce an entity that bowls on ground that often doesn't belong to him, and introduce the richness of the outside world, and the next moment you're sitting with conflict. And so the idea of relative deprivation explains a lot about what is going on in those societies, and I will stop with that. In terms of how we think about conflict and the statement the gentleman made here in front, there's always, perhaps I need to be anecdotal here and tell a bit of a story. I attended a conference in the Netherlands, and the opening of the conference was two professors who presented two opposing views on illegal immigration in Europe. The one from Spain, the other from Sweden. The one presenting a very realist perspective, stop them at the borders, time off. The other a very normative approach, very idealistic. We can absorb them. We can make them part of our societies. We can bring about peace by breaking down the borders and making them part of us. And that demonstrates often the dichotomy that you're sitting with between the realist approaches in thinking about conflict, violence and war, and sometimes very normative, idealistic, constructivist ideas on peace and security in the world. Yeah, I'm going to stop there.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Abel. Yes, Andries? Yes, okay.
Well, I agree with you that there is a great skewness in the way countries allocate their defense budget. And I want to ask a question to you about the way that picture was drawn up. Because is it a way of a percentage of the GDP of the country, or is it the actual amount that is given to defense? Because it's obviously the four economic, which brings me to economic conflict, the four economic powerhouses being North America, Europe, India, China. It's clear as hell that they spend the most on defense, and that the least people die there, if I take the next picture. But you also said something about the economy of defense and of war. I actually want to say that they perhaps make their money at the places where the most people die and where the least amount of money is spent on defense. I think you alluded to that with what you were saying. I want also to I'm still mulling over the next thing I'm going to say, so don't pepper me with too much questions. In a way, I want to make the comment that democracy could be a peaceful conflict of ideas, even religion and ideology. And I also agree with you, the whole thing that the danger with ideology and even with the religion is that it can only come from the ashes of whatever was there before. And if I take the example of, which is sometimes used after the Second Anglo-Boer War, where a lot of destruction took place. And when the National Party, whatever, came into power in 1948, it was one of the few instances in the world where there was a regime change, where the infrastructure of the current state was not destroyed, but what was actually built upon. And you get this a lot, well, seemingly in Africa, that you get, and let me take the example of some resettlement farms, and it's close to home in Namibia, where you have a well looked after farmhouse and all of that, but when there's people resettled on it, there seems to be the destruction of whatever was built there. So it builds on this thing that something else must grow from the ashes of whatever was there, but that first must be destroyed. So this whole notion of building on something is lacking. I don't know how that is actually a conflict to your conflict idea.
Thank you. The lady here in front. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Kathleen. I'm coming from a background where on Saturday, a good friend of mine was in Mariental. And in Mariental, he had gone to bury his best friend and his wife. This best friend was a police officer, married. We went to the wedding a year or two ago. And the issue of violent death is so real and painful. He shot his wife and turned the gun to himself. That is true. There is violent death going on. There is peace and stability here, but have you studied that? How can that be stopped? Is it an issue of, I want to come out of a relationship and this guy wants me and I don't know how to go out of it? Is there any study to stop that? Because it's so common here in Namibia, where somebody shoots, I'm sure he used a service pistols. And it's a painful one. This is a person I know. It's not a story in the newspaper. I went to their wedding. The second one, on violent death in South Africa, I think a lot of my people are dying in South Africa. I'm Zimbabwean. And the reason they are dying in South Africa is that they can't stay at home. The reason why they can't stay at home is because there are all these sanctions at a political level that is making home uncomfortable to stay. And you end up with a tie around your neck and you are burnt to death. I went to the village a few weeks ago to bury my mom. Of course, she didn't die in a violent death. But I was shown two graves of my fellow village people who died in South Africa. One was just found dead in his house. The other one was really shot dead. He had owned a hardware in South Africa and was told, pick up and go, my brother. And he said, how do I pick up and go? I've been here for 20 years. And they pulled the trigger on his head. So violent death, they are inducing circumstances, forcing a lot of people into South Africa, including my own people. What are the studies being done to stop such a thing? Because in as much as we may think that our leaders are so corrupt and they are not accepted by the West, it's killing our people. It's killing the people I eat with every day, my sisters, my best friends, and all that. What is being done? Are we only studying this violent killing at an abstract level, or can we bring it home to say, whatever sanctions that there are, they must be stopped, because they are forcing people out and they are being killed. Those numbers you had up there, they are so real. And I live in it, and these are people I live with. What studies are being done, or can it be stopped? I know there are sanctions on Zimbabwe. I'm studying to become a political scientist, but in the interim, should people just sit and sign off these Zidera sanctions that are causing all this chaos, and we think there's peace and stability in Zimbabwe when people are going out and being killed. And right now, as I speak, I'm told that money that I saved in my account is now equivalent to zero because of a new policy the government put in place. Why? Because the money cannot buy. The economy is dead. Isn't that violent on my future and on my future children? What studies are being done? What are we saying about it? Is it just a silent thing we should ignore and look at Ukraine and this 15 million Zimbabweans don't count? I don't know. It's a question I'm putting out there, but I'm saying I agree that there's a lot of violent death. What is inducing that violent death? How can we recommend the stoppage of this, unworthy loss of life? Thank you.
Thank you. There's a hand at the back, the gentleman, and then that gentleman.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, I think the gentleman in the back was first. Can you just pass it to him first? Yes, please.
Doctor, first of all, thank you very much for coming to Namibia and talking to us about such. One thing the first question I had is how we're always looking at external invasions or factors when it comes to war. But sometimes war can start inside a country, not necessarily from external factors, but internally between people. What can we do to resolve such type of conflict before it implodes and becomes problematic externally, internally, not externally? Because defense usually focuses on the external threats, but internally, like her, I can allude to what you were saying, that like in South Africa, it's chaotic. Especially, it's like there isn't really a sense of security, and when things happen, and then it's like almost like people react after. It's never like, no, it's happening now. Deploy the defense force of the police. That's the first question I have. Like, how can countries actually avoid such situations internally? Because most African countries, what usually happens is that the chaos starts internally before the international community comes in and starts commenting and so forth and starts, sending aid. Yeah, that's the first one. Secondly, I don't know if you said, I don't know if the doc said it's the Russian escapade or, I don't know, adventure in Ukraine. I've been following that situation very carefully and diligently. Doc, for the past about 6-8 years, the Ukrainians have been moving their military installations closer to the Russian border. Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, warned them on 2 or 3 occasions that, look, stop moving your military installations or we will react, right? They continued until what the Russian president actually quoted when it was translated into English. He said that they actually moved their missiles to Russia's doorstep. So the American and Western sponsored military artillery was on Russia's border. But then when the Russian president reacts with forceful action, it becomes a thing of no, it's illegal and so forth. And to take it further, the Russians are not part of the ICC. So who determines what is illegal or what is not illegal when it comes to such an invasion? If somebody was the aggressor, whoever was backing them, and they were told that, listen, we will react if you continue pushing the boundaries, but they continue to push the boundaries. But now when the Russians react, it's, oh no, it's like World War III, So I wanted to ask, how does one actually determine which side was problematic in that type of situation and which side was kind of defending, yeah.
Thank you, sir. Can you just pass the microphone to the gentleman in front and then to the other side? Because it's a hand there as well. Thank you.
Okay,
And
thanks
after that, we'll ask Abel to respond. Yes?
I think what the lady just now mentioned is a different kind of conflict. If it affects yourself, and the question is, if a government, for example, takes away your money, is that conflict? So conflict shouldn't only be war. I think if we can agree on that one, I think then I doubt whether conflict is really going down. Because we have now, what is it, 8 billion people here, and there are so many conflicts, and by each head that's coming out, there will be more conflict in future. So there will be more conflict from that point of the societal view, not from a perspective of war. The question is now, must conflict always be violent? Because here my friend mentioned the example of Bhutan. There the government is trying, for example, to look at not the GDP, but the gross domestic happiness index, what they are having. The government is looking at making people happy, not like here in this case taking away people's money. So that's one of the exceptions, I think, in the world. Another example from small communities, the First Nations in Northern America. They were living according to the motto, if you do something, look at the consequences for 7 generations in the future. Now who is looking what's happening in the future in 7 generations with my children? Is that not also something to avoid conflict? Because if you take a wrong decision now, you know the future generations will suffer under that, if it's a bad decision. And they will reap benefits if it's a good decision. So look in the future. But we have more and more conflict. I mean, I agree with that one. So the question is, what do we learn from history? Answer is that we have not learned from history. Thanks.
Thank you. The gentleman outside, please, and then Professor Esterhuyse.
Good evening, and thank you for the talk. You can call me Prince K. I'm going to be short. I'm tall enough already. I agree and disagree. I mean, on the talk, I agree that conflict is part of our makeup, but I think violence is not inherently human. I know a lot of societies and communities that have been driven to conniptions of anger, but they have not responded in a violent way. I think it's about upbringing and the economic condition. I think there is a lot of factors at play that will erode the spirit, the human spirit, and drive it to violence. I don't think it's inherently us.
Thank you very much. Professor Esterhuyse, would you like to respond?
Thank you for some really interesting questions. One reason I need to start with you. You're asking the difficult questions that I hope people don't ask. That picture was on the amount of money. It's not on the percentage of defense budgets. Okay, you can hear? Okay. But even if you work on the percentage of budgets, irrespective of how you do the calculation, there's a disconnect between who is spending money on defense in the world and where the money is going in terms of developing war-fighting capacity. And I will give you just one fact in this regard. United Nations, the United States spending more money on defense than the next 19 states on the list. Every 49 cents in a defense dollar that is spent in the world on defense is being spent by the United States. That's a mind-boggling figure, but it's not telling the whole story. Because if you look at the financing model of, let's say, research in the United States, a lot of money is channeled via the Department of Defense to universities for research. And it is actually included in the defense budget. So it's very difficult to really calculate the defense budgets and what is being spent. You find this if you go onto the Peace Research Institute, the Socratic Peace Research Institute, and the amount of data you have available there, it makes it a very murky type of environment to do research on. In terms of the question about democracy, I have no doubt that there's value in the democratic peace theory, that democracies are relatively more safe, more stable, more secure than non-democratic countries. And there's also some truth in the idea that democracies don't fight each other. But it's a Scottish verdict. It's not yet proven. We can accept it as the truth until it's proven wrong. But there's no data for us to work on this. But up until now, it seems as if democracies are relatively safe. In terms of the role of ideology and religion, education is perhaps a primary vehicle for dealing with ideology and religion. And I'm talking about ideology and religion here in its extremes, in the fundamentalistic domain, in the fundamentalistic nature thereof. None of us can walk away from ideology. We're all indoctrinated in a way. We all believe in something. So you cannot really walk away from those realities. But education seems to help you to guide through the complexities and steer away from the extremist sort of elements thereof. I'm going, and part of that is to perhaps understand that educated people tend to be much more inclusive in their thinking and their outlook on life than people who have not gone through the process of education. And I'm sounding elitist here, and it is unfortunately a reality. Education is an elitist thing. I'm not apologizing for that, it's just a fact, and we can have a debate on that. The societal violence, I want to be soft with you because it's hard issues you're talking about. And I'm not going to give you a long answer on this. But culture is playing a role in this, and I'm not talking about ethnic culture here. I'm talking about societal culture here. If violence has become an ingrained part of societal culture, it takes at least 3 generations to turn that around. And unfortunately, the enculturement of people in certain societies in Southern Africa have given us institutionalized violence in a way that we've never seen it in the rest of the world, at least in the era we're living in. The question about internal conflict, there's a well body of literature on internal conflict, and I don't want to dwell too much on it. For me, a useful way of thinking about that is the ideas of Barry Boozen, where he talks about the difference between a strong and weak state and the difference between a strong and a weak power. The idea of a strong and weak state is rooted in the strength of the bureaucratic institutions of the state. And you may have a relatively weak state. The idea of weak and strong states is more an economic and military idea than, or power rather. It's more a military and economic idea. And in many countries you have relatively weak states, but because of the strength of their institutions, you immediately confronted with a situation where the potential for internal conflict is much less, because the capacity of the state to deliver the little bit that can be delivered is so much better. But I don't want to. There's so much to be said about internal conflict. It's a whole study field on its own. So I'm going to stick to that. The Ukraine, I'm going to deliberately steer away from the discussion of the war in Ukraine. I think it's a highly deliberate or a highly controversial war. The problem with the war is that there are so many narratives that has been created by the conflicting parties that it's absolutely impossible almost to pick up the signals between the noise that is floating out there. And if you then have, and I'm not directing this at you as a person, but if you then have people who don't read the three requirements for reading, to read in context, in depth, and in width. If you then have people who don't read in context, in depth, and in width about the conflict, there's a propensity, there's almost a natural sort of sideline of conspiracy theories about the war, and I'm blatantly honest with you if I say this to you, so I prefer to steer away from answering questions about that tonight. Perhaps for you to go and think about, though, is the difference between a war of necessity and a war of choice. And whether the war in the Ukraine was a war of choice for Russia or a war of necessity. Your answer about peaceful conflict, one of the definitions, in fact the definition that I highlighted, André Beaufre's definition, is the dialectic of two opposing worlds using force to resolve the dispute. André Beaufre is not saying what kind of force. My wife always tells me that I'm forceful in my arguments. So force means, it is not saying anything about hardcore means as a way of dealing with conflict. The idea of a dispute is also not something that is automatically associated with conflict, with violent conflict and war per se. We're finding disputes every day around us. You just need to go to work every day, and I guarantee you within the first hour at work you will be most probably in a conversation with somebody about differences that you've learned. It's not necessarily unfolding in a violent way. It's often a peaceful conversation, but we differ. But there's no doubt that it's a dialectic of wills, that you want to enforce your will on it. So that's why I found that definition such a useful definition, because its applicability in so many contexts and environments. Violence as an inherent human activity, our tall gentleman have left us. I cannot agree with him more. For me, the tool to deal with this is education. And I'm blatantly honest if I say the more educated people become, the less they are orientated to be violent in their approaches in solving conflict. And you can never underestimate the importance of education. And I'm not talking about university education here, I'm talking about people who've developed the ability to conceptualize the world in a higher order way and have developed the attributes of educated people. I'm going to do that.
Thank you, Abel. I'll give you a chance right now. We have to watch our time. We normally close at 8, so I would just like to, perhaps you've had an opportunity, may I ask, I've heard a couple of people, in fact, asking why are these things happening. I'm listening to this lady and some of the other, mentions as well. Is there anybody here tonight that would like to make a statement, yes, on why? Why?
Exactly. Okay, I have one remark to make and one proposal, which I'm prepared to share with you under one condition. And that is that you don't turn violent against me. All right, first the remark. If you study your history since whatever, how far you can go back, there's always one condition for a violent war, especially between states, and that is the density of population and the ratio between the number of people to the number of hectares or acres, or however you want to measure that, they had to at their disposal to cultivate their food. African wars before Chaka Zulu, and Chaka Zulu learned his law from the British. African wars were never longer than 3, maximum 6 months. Why? Because the warriors had to go home to harvest. It doesn't make sense to win whatever you could win if you have nothing to eat. Now, in Germany, that's where I come from and where I know a little bit more about the demographics and about other countries, there was a surplus in 1870 to 71, the last big wars, tribal wars in Germany. Then there was a heavy overpopulation relative to the land to be cultivated. So they could afford to send what they call Schutztruppen or whatever. And the same is for the other imperial forces. So that's one issue which I think is important to have in mind. Now comes my proposal. Am I protected? Okay. For a situation that one can, political situation that one can control, like for example the state, like for example Namibia or others. Limit the maximum income for Namibia, for example, my proposal is 100,000 Namibian dollars, meaning you cannot earn more. Meaning, we should, and the state has, by the way, done that recently, they doubled the tax-free amount from 50,000 a year to 100,000 a year, which will create a lot of local demand, because people who earn that kind of money, they will spend every dollar they can put their hands on. If you earn 100,000, come on, be honest. I mean, maybe the first year or maximum 2 you can spend $100,000 a month. After that, I mean, I wouldn't be able to. I mean, you can only have one set of clothes and whatever. You can waste it here and there by buying so many cars. But anyway, in a real sense of life and life quality, 100,000 bucks a month guarantee you a very comfortable, carefree, simple, easy taking care of lifestyle. So if we would now, and I discussed that with the Minister of Finance, when they were proudly announcing that now they were doubling the tax-free amount at the bottom, I said, what about the top? So the reason why I'm talking so long time about that is, if we would have a society where I can say to you, listen, you may be poorer than me, whatever, but the difference between us is not that big. It is there, but it is maybe because I'm more intelligent, and more heavy-working, and more disciplined, and more whatever I may be. But you have an equal chance to at least get to a level where you be safe. And when you're safe, I think you have much less reason to become violent against me. So that was my proposal. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. There is a hand right at the back. Bronwyn, right at the back is the hand.
Yes, my name is Wolfgang Werner. I just have several points, but one disagreement, and that refers to your last point about education. I don't think that education in and of itself is a guarantee against violence, against wars. As a matter of fact, I think probably the most educated countries worldwide are the ones that start wars. The United States, probably by all accounts, I don't know the figures, but probably more educated on average than many other countries in the world. They are amongst the big warmongers in the world. So I'm not quite sure, and I'd like to hear you out on this. We have in our own country what's referred to as a marginalized group, the San people. By all accounts, the least educated people in our society. And probably the population group that is completely, what shall I say, averse, or a population group in which violence, as far as we know, is not known. Physical violence is not known. There may be conflicts, but those people with a very low level of formal education have mechanisms to deal, and they've dealt with this kind of the disputes and the conflicts over centuries. So I'm not sure that education is a guarantee for anything. As a matter of fact, I think it's the educated people that run production systems and distribution systems that, in my opinion, give rise to conflicts. And that point relates to a little point that was made in the introduction to this talk about human nature. I seem to remember that it said that humans are innately competitive, egoistic, pride. To what extent is this true, and to what an extent are these traits, these characteristics in human people produced by a system that, to put it bluntly and very simplistically, is geared towards profit maximization? It's a system that, if you want to really keep head above water, you have to be competitive. You have to, on occasion, become nasty. You have to do things that you would not normally do if you were living in a system, and Howard made the point, a more egalitarian system where people are being looked after. Now, these are utopian ideas. And I think especially for the young people, it's very important to be able to think utopias. If we cannot think about utopias, I think we are lost, because then we don't see any development towards a better future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yeah, there's another hand. There's a lady in black there.
Thank you. Prof, I have a question that I would like to piggyback off the gentleman here. As a country, I'm bringing this closer to home now, as Namibia, we weren't really allowed to mourn our history. I was just speaking with a colleague of mine, and I was asking her, how do we reconcile the history of the country's history, or the nation's history rather? How do we reconcile it back? Because as a nation now, or as a generation, we are healing and moving forward. But should the next generation come up, like the millennials or everyone else following us, they have to go back into history, and then the cycle keeps, it's almost like a vicious cycle. Each generation comes to, it's almost like a bottleneck. We all reach there, then we deal, we move over, and then the next comes. So how do you reconcile that idea, especially now with what the gentleman said on for future generations, basically, because you would keep getting angry, conflict will keep coming up. Even currently, I don't think conflict has been dealt with. We're sort of just tolerating the situation or keeping it, under wraps, but we're not really dealing with the impact of it. Yeah, thank you.
Very much. Next, we have to watch time. Would you like to respond before we close?
The first question, demographics. And demographics is one of those variables in conflict that I've been sort of getting my hands into for the last couple of months, because one of the things that I don't understand about demographics is precisely how you link that to conflict. And I will give you an example of where my interest in demographics has its roots. From a demographical perspective, the Russian population is in trouble. If you look at the Russian demographic profile, the 1990s, they went into an absolute nosedive. And
You mean in terms of numbers?
In terms of numbers and in terms of babies born. And now we're 20 years down the line, and those are the generation that's now supposed to report for military service. And Russia is sitting with a real problem. And if you add to that the problem of alcoholism in society in the age bracket between 18 and 40, the fact that because perhaps of the alcohol problem, it has the highest percentage of unnatural deaths in that age bracket in the world, the fact that Russian women don't want to marry Russian men, they're exporting women to the rest of the world. There's perhaps a Russian woman or two here. You can add to that the disintegration of the Russian education and health system in the last 30, 40 years. And then you don't understand what is now going on in Russia. I'm just sort of, there's actually no people to fight a war, if I can put it like that. There's also an interesting dynamic between what they refer to as white Russians and black Russians, and European Russians and non-European Russians. And if you now look at a map of who's fighting and who's dying in Ukraine, it's not European Russians dying in Ukraine, it's black Russians dying in Ukraine. So there's an interesting dynamic in terms of demographics, and it's not only the Russians. We're sitting with a major demographic problem in China. Major, an absolute disaster in terms of, so demographics is a fascinating factor in conflict, and it doesn't really gives us a lot of answers in that. And so I'm actually saying to you, I don't know. I'm reading in this, and I don't know. Yeah, the balance between the haves and the have-nots, the Western values, the role of education. It's difficult questions you're asking, and I cannot give you answers. I talk about education, I'm not necessarily referring to, and I've made the point that I'm not necessarily referring to formal university education. For me, the most basic form of education is the education that the kids is provided to at home in the first 5 years of their lives. And in many violent societies, what you do find is that that's precisely the period where the education is not doing what it's supposed to do. I can give you another example of the education profile, the problem we're sitting on the Cape Flats with. Most beautiful colored kids up until age 11, 12, being raised by the aunts and the aunties. It's a matriarchal society. The omas and the aunties and the mothers raise them. Beautiful kids up until age 11, 12. And then they're going into the teenage years. And the dads, where are they? Gangsterism. Biggest number of dads in the prison of a particular group in the world. The role of alcohol and other forms of, and so at that particular point, things then fall apart for that society, because the little boys are just pulled into the same cycle of violence that their dads have grown up in. And so education for me is not only formal education, it's specifically the education that is provided in the family environment. That's the primary building block of society, and is that not in place, you're sitting with a problem. And that's also my answer to the whole idea of profit marginalization. And I can talk the whole night about that. We cannot walk away from the way in which people are being brought up in Western society by implication is a competitive society. It's a tough society to survive in. It's a society that has created stress and all other kinds of sicknesses because of the competitiveness of society. We can talk a whole night about that. So underpinning the development of the society is a culture, and it raises the question of enculturement. How do you go about enculturing your kids, whether in a formal or an informal way? And by enculturing them in a competitive way, you by implication almost setting them up for competition in the world in many ways. And if they are not succeeding in that competition, it becomes a difficult world for them. So there's different perspectives on this, and what you've described is a typical Western phenomenon. But there's other problems. You're sitting in other societies where you don't have this kind of competitiveness, and we often see that in Africa, for example, where you then struggle with development and progress and upliftment. So there's a different culture at play. So it's not a simple answer that I'm going to give you. I think there's multiple variables at play here. your question, where's the lady? Your question about the historical realities of what Namibia finds itself. And I can only say to you that perhaps an anecdotal example from our own society, and I always find it fascinating, especially if you mingle with people in the Free State and the Transvaal, how sensitive they still are about a war that ended in 1902, and how the English, that this discomfort with the English are still sort of featuring in the back of their minds. I have a very good friend in Ireland. His first words to me is that at least South Africa and the Irish we have one thing in common, and that is that we don't necessarily like the British very much. But in our sort of effort to understand precisely what you are talking about, I think there's two factors to consider. The one is that it takes a number of generations to grow out of the sorrow and the deep-rooted structural violence that has been committed against people in a specific society. And it takes 2 to 3 generations, and we've often talk about the Irish society, and they're not out of it as yet. So that's the one answer that I sort of want to share with you, and it's not the truth that I'm sharing with you. I'm sharing ideas. The second point that I want to share with you, if I refer to the 7 contexts that I've had on the board, then the historical context is just one of those contexts. And there's a whole range of contexts, other contexts at play as well. And so the danger here, I think, for the younger generation is precisely that, not to be overwhelmed, not to be kept back by the historical context they find themselves in, because there's other contexts. There's also political, economic, and geographical and other contexts that have changed fundamentally in the last 20, 30, 40 years, and that's also as important as the historical context. And with that, I'm not saying the historical context is not important. I'm just saying perhaps one needs to stand back and say, here's the historical context, but I cannot allow the historical context to be overwhelmed, me being overwhelmed by the historical context moving forward.
Thank you very much. Time is up. Ladies and gentlemen, just time for a few things. Let me just say something on, I see a lot of new faces here tonight. And I couldn't help listening to you, listening to your pain, listening to your questions, your challenges. I couldn't help thinking back on the 10 years we've been coming and the magnificent presentations we've had at the Socratic Forum. In particular, I'm thinking back to the presentations on the work of Paul Ricoeur. I don't know if you still remember that. It was done by Professor Johan Snyman from Victoria. There are still people stopping me in the street nowadays, say we will never forget these presentations, and perhaps we must sort of revive them and invite them back. And I can promise you, the issues that we have been listening here to tonight, these things will become on the agenda of the Socratic Forum on the way forward. I would like to ask Andreas or Bolser to do the vote of thanks for us. When I was thinking, who should I ask now tonight to do the vote of thanks, I thought, well, I think I'll ask the guy that stopped me the most in the street asking when is the Socratic Forum starting again. It was a regular. So, Andreas, please. Would you...
Which Andreas?
Andreas.
Two Andreases.
Oh,
you win. No confidence.
I'm 72 years old, I'm retired. I spent 40 years in public health service in Namibia from 1978 as administrator of the Central Hospital in Kuratura and as an anaesthetist in theatre. And I've had time to think, and I'd just like to formally thank Windhoek for sponsoring Critical Thought, because the last decade was filled by presentations where you often had more questions than answers at the end, which means you stimulate thought actively. So the forum was there. Socrates was in fact asked to drink hemlock because he was a pain asking too many questions and there's never a finite answer. But if we look for a finite answer, we'll never get that, because life starts with a big bang and then there's infinity. So I want to thank Windhoek for having the insight and the foresight for society to promote critical thought and to support Willem, who is the driving force behind the society and brings good people to stimulate our thoughts. At the same time, I'm also aware that besides stimulating critical thought, Windhoek is also looking at food security. They've got a program where they're looking at the elimination of food waste in Namibia, because that is the most fundamental growth factor by UNICEF is food security. So you on that program, and then I think the Capricorn, well that part of your group. Then Gondwana, I think Gondwana is the drifting continent, and it's a concept where people share nature and the people that work share in the assets of the country. And then especially I want to thank Prof. Esterhuyse for the insight, the oversight, the foresight, and the hindsight, which means vision. And we in Namibia have a concept of Vision 2030, which involves prosperity by our own input with peace, security, and democracy. So we are aiming for something which we haven't got. But unless we have a vision and an aim, we'll never reach it. And I think the golden rule in life is in fact a trilogy of relationships. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Be a good neighbor and a good Samaritan. Do unto your mind and body as you would have your mind and body do to you, because your mind and body is the temple of your soul. Look after your soul. And the last of the trilogy is do unto Mother Nature as you would have her do to you, then ecology will be in harmony. And then about meaning in life, the good, the moral and ethical, the true, the facts, not opinions, and the beautiful, imagination and creativity. And on CNN, there's often a little jingle which comes between the news which says, we share this place, we all belong. And I think that sort of sums up that we part of humanity, of the human race, and we are together on the same planet. And for us to go forward, we need a compass and we need passion. And if you combine compass and passion, you have compassion. And then you move forward, sharing and caring. And then there's a future. But conflict is like a person with a bipolar mood disorder. Manic and then depressive, and it's yo-yos. We need a leveling playing field and sharing and caring. I want to thank you for stimulating our thought, and I look forward to us resuming these discussions with more questions and answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andreas. Just two last remarks. He mentioned Bank Windhoek's food program. When you leave the room, you'll find refreshments on the outside, courtesy of Bank Windhoek and Gondwana collection. And then I've got a couple of people asked me even today, how can I get my name on the electronic notification list? I've got two clipboards here. I'll put it down here if you want. If you're not yet on the electronic list, you would like to be, come and write it down, and you'll be added to the list. And then you will receive. It is not to be confused with the communication from the bank. It is a private thing by one of the supporters of the forum. So, but it works very well. And in saying goodbye, I couldn't help thinking when Andreas was talking. I couldn't help thinking of the goodbye words or phrases used by the Quechua people in Peru. Have you heard that, ladies and gentlemen? When they greet each other, they don't say just goodbye. They shake hands, yes, but they say, don't lie, don't steal, and don't be lazy. Thank you very much. Good night.